September 1944. The Pacific is in flames, island after island being ripped from the hands of the Japanese Empire in a war that already seemed endless. The American Marines had crossed Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, each name a scar on the collective memory of a generation. And then Peleliu appeared, a small speck of coral in the middle of the ocean, 6 square miles of volcanic rock lost among the warm waters of the South Pacific. The officers gathered their men and spoke with rehearsed confidence. 4 days of fighting, minimal resistance, a quick operation before the great push on the Philippines. 4 days, they said, maybe less. But Peleliu held secrets that no intelligence report had revealed, horrors that no map could have anticipated. What was promised as a brief mopping-up operation turned into 73 days of hell that defied human description. 73 days of sweltering heat that melted the men's sanity, of sharp coral that cut like glass with every step, of endless caves where death lurked in every shadow. This was the battle that the commanders themselves, years later, would admit with silent shame. It didn't need to happen. Peleliu wasn't necessary. The men who died there, the thousands who were maimed, traumatized, destroyed, all paid the price for a strategic error that cost too much blood for territory that mattered less. Imagine a place where the ground itself is your enemy, where every square meter of land seems designed not by geology, but by pure malice. The coral on Peleliu wasn't like the sandy beaches the Marines had known before. It was crystallized volcanic rock, sharp as shards of glass, sharp as blades waiting for unprotected flesh. You couldn't lie down for cover without tearing your uniform and your skin. You couldn't crawl without leaving a trail of blood. And above all this, the Pacific sun hammered down mercilessly, pushing thermometers past 115 degrees Fahrenheit, turning metal helmets into brain-cooking ovens, making the air tremble with heat waves that distorted vision and reality. There was no clean water. There was no shade. There was no mercy. The island itself seemed alive, sentient, determined to kill every man who dared set foot on its cursed soil. This is not the story of every Marine who fought on Peleliu, though each deserves to be remembered. This is the story of one, a real man, not the perfect hero of war propaganda or patriotic headlines, not the soldier who received the Medal of Honor or whose name was engraved on monuments. This is the story of the ordinary Marine, if anything about these men can be called ordinary. He was 19 years old when he stepped onto that beach. 19 years and a lifetime of naivete that would be burned to ashes in a matter of hours. He was sent to die on an island that didn't matter, for reasons no one could satisfactorily explain. And somehow, by some miracle or curse, he survived. But surviving doesn't mean returning whole. Surviving doesn't mean forgetting. This Marine returned home in body, but a fundamental part of who he was, perhaps the best part, was buried in that bloody coral forever. For 73 days, this Marine faced a question no military training manual can answer. A question that haunts the silent corridors of consciousness of every soldier who has ever fought in a war with no clear meaning. When the mission makes no sense, when every order seems to be sending you to your death for nothing, when the strategy is obviously flawed and the objectives vaguely defined, why do we still fight? Why don't we simply drop our weapons and refuse to advance? What keeps a man moving forward when every cell in his body screams to run in the opposite direction? It's not abstract patriotism, he discovered. It's not speeches about freedom and democracy. It's something more primal, more personal, more sacred. It's the man at your side. It's the refusal to abandon your brother. It's the impossible choice between dying, trying, or living a coward's life. On Peleliu, every Marine learned that sometimes you don't fight for the flag. You fight because to stop means betraying the only men in the world who truly understand the hell you share. Eugene Sledge was there, a young Marine who would later find the words to describe the unspeakable. Decades later, still haunted by the memories that never freed him, he wrote with a brutal honesty only survivors possess. Peleliu was a netherworld of horror from which escape seemed less and less likely as casualties mounted and the fighting dragged on and on. A netherworld of horror. These are not words chosen lightly. Sledge knew the vocabulary of war. He had been trained to kill, conditioned to endure, prepared for combat. But Peleliu was beyond training, beyond preparation, beyond any concept of war that military textbooks could convey. It was a waking nightmare that refused to end, a descent into hell from which there was no return. And the more time passed, the more men fell. The longer the fighting dragged on week after week, the more impossible the idea of escaping alive seemed. This is not a tale of military glory. This is not a story of heroic victory. This is a story about pure survival, about what human beings can endure when every instinct tells them they've endured too. Much. Stephen Ambrose dedicated his life to understanding the experience of ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. And he taught us that war isn't about strategy and statistics. It's about men facing the impossible. He showed us how the paratroopers in Bastogne fought not just the German army, but the murderous cold of the European winter, the siege that threatened to starve them to death, the desperation that comes when supplies run out and help fails to arrive. The Marines on Peleliu faced a different but equally relentless enemy. Yes, there were Japanese soldiers determined to fight to the death, but the true enemy was the island itself. It was the heat that killed men before any bullet could reach them. It was the coral that turned every movement into agony. It was the thirst that drove Marines to drink from puddles contaminated with oil and blood. It was the brutal geography that turned every elevation into an impenetrable fortress. In Bastogne, the enemy was winter and the siege. On Peleliu, the enemy was the land itself, and unlike the Germans, unlike the weather, the land never retreats, never surrenders, never shows mercy. The island wanted those Marines dead, and it fought alongside the Japanese with a malevolence that seemed almost conscious. This is the story of Peleliu. This is the story of a Marine sent to conquer the unconquerable, ordered to survive what should not be survived, forced to become something he never imagined. For 73 days, he descended into hell. And when he finally emerged, broken, changed, unrecognizable to himself, he discovered that hell had come with him, nestled in his mind, etched in his soul, waiting in the nightmares that would visit him every night for the rest of his life. This is his story. And through it, perhaps we can glimpse, however imperfectly, what it means to pay the real price of freedom, not in patriotic speeches or solemn ceremonies, but in blood, in sanity, in pieces of soul left behind on a forgotten island in the middle of the Pacific. Aboard the transport ship, the night before the landings, the Marines sat with dozens of other men in the stuffy hold as an officer climbed onto a makeshift box to deliver the final briefing. The officer was young, overconfident, with the kind of certainty that comes from never having been under live fire. He unrolled a map of the island and pointed to the markings with a pen that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from barely contained excitement. His words came quickly and rehearsed, as if he were reciting a script written by someone who had never seen combat. "Minimal resistance," he said. "The Japanese forces are disorganized, scattered, demoralized by recent defeats. 4 days of operations, maybe 5 at most. Soon we'll be sailing toward the Philippines, where the real war is taking place. Peleliu is just a footnote, a necessary cleansing before the big spectacle." The men around the Marine reacted differently. Some smiled with genuine relief, truly believing that this time would be different, that this time the promises would be kept. Others laughed nervously, that tense laugh soldiers use to disguise the fear they can't admit. The veterans, those who had seen other beaches, other optimistic briefings that turned into bloody lies, remained silent, their faces hardened by experience, their eyes saying what their mouths dared not. The Marine pulled out pen and paper and began writing a quick letter home. The words came easily, casually, as if he were telling of a weekend of camping instead of an amphibious invasion. "I'll be back soon," he wrote. "This will be easy. Don't worry. See you soon." He folded the letter and tucked it into the inside pocket of his uniform. Something deep inside him whispered that he was lying, that nothing on Peleliu would be easy, but he wanted to believe. God, how he wanted to believe. September 15th, 1944, 8:32 in the morning. The landing craft doors opened with a metallic sound the Marine would never forget, revealing Peleliu Beach for the first time. For a moment, a single moment suspended in time, everything seemed almost tranquil. The water was an impossible blue, the kind of blue you see in tropical postcards. The beach stretched white and glistening in the morning sun. If it weren't for the warships exploding behind them and the smell of gunpowder in the air, you might almost imagine you were arriving in paradise. But then the Marine took his first step off the craft. His foot touched the shallow water, and all hell broke loose with a fury that felt personal, targeted, filled with pure hatred. Machine guns opened fire from positions intelligence reports swore didn't exist. Mortars began to fall with impossible precision, as if the Japanese had spent months calculating exactly where each craft would land. Artillery roared from the inland heights, turning the beach into a cauldron of sand, water, and flesh. The Marine ran, not thinking, just ran, his feet splashing in the water that quickly turned too red to be just coral. Men around him fell before they even reached the beach, their bodies collapsing into the shallow water, some screaming, others too silent, that horrible silence that means they're already gone. He jumped over bodies. Some he recognized, friends he'd played cards with the night before, men who'd laughed at his jokes about the easy 4 days. Hundreds died in the first hour. Not in heroic combat, not in medal-worthy hand-to-hand battles, they just died. Cut down as they ran, knocked down as they desperately tried to reach any cover, any protection from the metal, flying from all directions. When the Marine finally dove behind a coral outcrop that offered some protection, his first conscious awareness wasn't of the gunfire or the explosions. It was of the pain. His hands bled from where they'd touched the coral. His knees were ripped through his uniform. The first thing he understood about Peleliu was that the ground wasn't normal. This wasn't soft sand, like other beaches where the Marines had landed. This was coral, crystallized volcanic rock, processed by millions of years of geological pressure into something that seemed specifically designed to inflict human pain. Every surface was sharp as broken glass, sharp as razors, waiting for flesh. You couldn't lie down for cover without ripping your uniform and your skin with it. You couldn't crawl without leaving pieces of yourself in your wake. Men stumbling and falling rose with cut faces, bleeding from dozens of superficial wounds that, while not fatal, ached with an intensity that made it hard to think, hard to concentrate, hard to do anything but feel the constant agony. And then came the heat. Good God, the heat. The briefing had mentioned Peleliu would be hot, but mentioning it wasn't preparing. Nothing could prepare for this. 115 degrees Fahrenheit of pure, unrelenting heat. The Pacific sun didn't just heat, it attacked, it punished, it killed. The metal helmets the Marines wore became small portable ovens, conducting heat directly to the men's skulls, slowly cooking their brains. Their uniforms clung to their skin, drenched in sweat that gushed from every pore. Within minutes, men began to pass out, not from injuries, but simply from the heat, convulsions, violent vomiting. Bodies stiffened in spasms as heat stroke felled them as efficiently as any Japanese bullet. The Marine saw a man die of heat stroke before he even saw a single enemy soldier. He simply fell, convulsed for a few horrific seconds and stopped, dead, killed by the weather. Thirst came quickly, faster than anyone could have predicted. The water tanks carried on the vessels were punctured by shrapnel during the landing. Others were simply forgotten in the desperate rush for cover. Water was rationed immediately. Half a canteen per man per day. Half a canteen. In 15-degree heat, under constant fire, carrying heavy equipment, digging positions in the brutal coral. Half a canteen of water for 24 hours. It was a slow death sentence. The Marine watched his comrades make desperate decisions. Some drank from contaminated puddles, water mixed with oil, leaked from destroyed vehicles, blood from the wounded and dead. Everything you could imagine that shouldn't enter the human body. They drank anyway because the alternative was to die of thirst. Others tried to drink seawater, slowly going mad as the salt further dehydrated their already failing bodies. Thirst became a constant torture, a constant scream in the back of their minds that drowned out everything else, turning men into desperate animals who would do anything, risk anything, for just a sip of clean water. On the third day, only the third day of a battle that had been promised as a 4-day operation, the Marine had his brutal epiphany. He lay in a hole he had dug in the coral with his own bloody hands, staring up at the cloudless sky that offered zero relief from the murderous heat, listening to the constant gunfire that never seemed to stop, mentally counting how many men from his original platoon were still alive. Of the 40 who had landed together, perhaps 25 were still breathing. In 3 days, and the island had barely been penetrated. In that moment, with utter piercing clarity, he understood the truth the officers would never admit aloud. No one was coming to save them. There were no magical reinforcements waiting in the wings. There was no easy exit being planned on the command ships. There was no emergency evacuation if things got too bad. They were the reinforcements. They were the salvation. Either conquer this damned island with the men they had, or die trying. There was no third option. The promise of 4 days became a bitter joke the Marines whispered among themselves during the brief moments of silence between battles. 4 days. The phrase was repeated with hollow laughter, laughter that held no humor, only despair, and barely contained rage. 4 days turned into a week. 1 week turned into 2. And Peleliu continued, relentless, endless, a meat grinder that consumed men and spat out ghosts. The Marine stopped counting the days. He stopped thinking in terms of measurable time. Peleliu was endless. Peleliu was forever. And somewhere deep inside himself, in a place he didn't examine too closely because he was afraid of what he would find there, he began to accept that he might never leave this island. Perhaps the broken promise of 4 days was just the first of many lies, and the biggest lie of all was the idea that he would return home. When the Marines finally advanced beyond the beach and began penetrating Peleliu's interior, they discovered why the promise of 4 days had been a cruel fantasy from the start. The island was not just a mass of coral and burned vegetation. It was an elaborate underground fortress, an architectural nightmare built over months, perhaps years, by Japanese engineers who understood perfectly how to transform geography into genocide. More than 500 caves pierced the island's bowels, connected by tunnels that snaked through the rock like veins in a diseased body. Each cave had been fortified, equipped with machine guns, mortars and supplies for months of resistance. The Japanese did not plan to defend Peleliu above ground and die quickly in heroic fighting. They planned to let the Americans in, let them think they were winning, and then bleed every platoon, every company, every division until nothing remained but ghosts in blood-stained uniforms. The tactic was diabolical in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. Defense in depth, the military manuals called it, but that didn't remotely capture the psychological reality of what it meant to fight an enemy that could be literally anywhere. The Marines would advance, secure a position with blood and sweat, clear every meter with grenades and flamethrowers, count the enemy bodies, and move on. 10 minutes later, 15 minutes, half an hour later, the same position they had secured would start firing at them again. From the back, from the flanks, from below, through tunnel openings they hadn't noticed, that weren't on any map, that simply appeared like holes in hell opening to vomit death. The Marine cleared the same coral rise 3 times in a single day. 3 times he thought it was safe. 3 times Japanese soldiers emerged like ghosts from tunnels that shouldn't have existed, forcing the Marines to fight over the same damned rock again. The psychological terror of this form of warfare was worse than the physical danger. At least when you could see your enemy, when they were in front of you shooting, you could fire back. You could feel as if you had some control over your fate. But on Peleliu, the enemy was invisible, omnipresent, impossible to pinpoint or predict. You'd hear a shot and spin to locate its source, but the sound would ricochet off the coral walls, echo through the tunnels, come from everywhere and nowhere. A grenade would roll at your feet, and you'd throw yourself aside, survive, and rise. Trembling, but where had it come from? From that crevice in the rock 20 meters away. From that hole that seemed only a shadow. From beneath the ground you were standing on. The Marine developed a constant, debilitating fear that the very earth beneath his feet might open up and consume him. Every step became a gamble. Every pause to rest was potentially fatal. Sleep was nearly impossible because how do you sleep when the ground can literally betray you? The nights were worse than the days, if that were possible. In the pitch black darkness of Peleliu, no moon, no stars visible through the shroud of smoke and battle clouds, the Japanese began their most vicious psychological warfare. Screams came from the darkness, not just battle cries or banzai shouts, but calls in perfectly understandable English. "Marine! Help me! I'm hit! Marine, please!" The voice sounded desperate, compelling, exactly like a wounded American crying for help. The Marine heard these screams, and every fiber of his being wanted to respond, wanted to run and help a fallen comrade. But the veterans held his arm, whispering with fierce urgency, "It's a trap. It's always a trap." And it was. Always was. Marines who responded to the screams were found dead in the morning, their bodies mutilated in ways that suggested the death had not been quick. But what if it wasn't a trap? What if, just once, it really was a wounded American dying alone in the darkness because no one came? This doubt gnawed at the Marine's mind more effectively than any physical torture could. Clearing the caves required a special kind of courage, bordering on suicidal madness. It meant voluntarily entering dark tunnels where you couldn't see more than a meter in front of you, where the air was so stale and thick with smoke that every breath felt like it was sucking poison into your lungs. Flamethrowers were the primary weapon, terrifying devices that projected jets of incandescent napalm that stuck to anything it touched and burned at temperatures that melted flesh to the bone. The Marine watched flamethrower teams enter the caves, saw the bright orange flames briefly illuminate the tunnel entrances like gateways to hell, heard the screams, God, the screams, of men burning alive. Japanese men, yes, enemies who were trying to kill him, but men nonetheless, men who screamed as any human screams when fire consumes their flesh. The smell was indescribable. Burning flesh has an indelible odor, one that seeps into every pore, one that you taste in the back of your throat, one that lingers in your clothes and on your skin, no matter how many times you try to wash it off. When the flamethrowers failed, when the fuel ran out or the equipment clogged with the powdery coral that filled the air, the fighting became even more primal, even more personal, even more devastatingly intimate. Bayonets clashed in the darkness, metal against metal, metal against flesh. When the bayonets broke or became embedded in bodies, the men fought barehanded, punching, strangling, biting in some cases, reduced to the most basic form of violence our species knows. The Marine killed a Japanese soldier in a tunnel so narrow their faces were inches apart. He saw the man's eyes, saw the fear and determination mingled there, saw the exact moment life left and was replaced by emptiness. He felt the man's last, warm breath against his own face. That memory, that final breath, warm and moist and so human, would haunt him every night for the rest of his life. You don't forget the moment you take a life with your own hands. You don't forget that beneath the enemy uniform was just another young man who would probably rather be home with his family. the psychological toll of fighting ghosts in endless. Tunnels began to manifest in ways military medical manuals lacked the vocabulary to describe. Men began shooting at shadows, at nothing, in movements that existed only in their increasingly fractured minds. One Marine emptied an entire magazine into a charred tree he swore he'd seen move. Another threw grenades into an empty area for 20 minutes, screaming that there were Japanese there, that he could see them, even though everyone else saw only empty coral. Sleep became impossible for many, completely impossible. They simply stopped sleeping, lying awake day after day with increasingly wild eyes, shaking uncontrollably, jumping at every sound. Some were crying, grown men, hardened Marines, weeping like lost children. Others laughed for no apparent reason, loud, terrifying laughter that held no joy, only barely contained hysteria. The Marine saw one sergeant, a Guadalcanal veteran, a man who had survived hell before and become a legend among the troops, simply break down. He sat in the choir, hugging his knees to his chest, rocking back and forth in a repetitive, hypnotic motion. Tears streamed down his grime-covered face. "I can't take it anymore," he whispered over and over. "I can't take it anymore. I can't take it anymore." No one judged him. No one called him a coward. Everyone understood perfectly because they all felt the same way. And then there was the macabre ritual that every Marine on Peleliu learned through bitter and deadly experience. The dead didn't stay dead. Japanese soldiers played dead with a discipline and patience that defied comprehension. They lay among the genuinely dead bodies, perfectly still, waiting for hours if necessary, waiting for the Marines to drop their guard and pass by. Then they would explode grenades hidden beneath their bodies, killing themselves and taking as many Americans as they could. Or they would roll over and shoot unsuspecting Marines in the back. Or they would simply wait for night and crawl back into the tunnels to fight another day. The lesson was learned in American blood. You checked every body. Always. 3 times at least. First, you kicked from afar, ready to retreat if there was any movement. Second, you turned the body over with the point of the bayonet, checking for hidden grenades, for signs of breathing. Third, and this was the hardest for men who still wanted, to believe they were civilized, you shot them in the head, even if the body was clearly already dead, even if it seemed cruel, inhumane, a violation of every moral code you'd been taught. Because on Peleliu, pity killed, compassion killed. Assuming your enemy followed the same rules of war as you killed. The Marine became very good at shooting corpses, and a part of his soul died every time he pulled the trigger. His name was Johnny Kowalski from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 20 years old, married for 8 months, to a girl named Dorothy, who worked in a munitions factory while waiting for her husband to come home. He carried her picture in his shirt pocket, next to his heart, and showed it to anyone who cared to see, a pretty dark-haired girl with a shy smile, gazing into the camera as if gazing at the future she planned to build with Johnny. He talked about her constantly, especially at night when conversations turned confessional in the darkness. He talked about the house they were going to buy, small but their own. He talked about the children they would have, 2 or 3, maybe 4, if Dorothy agreed. He talked about the job his father had promised him at the steel mill, unglamorous but honest, enough to support a family. Johnny had plans. Johnny had dreams. Johnny was beside the Marine when the bullet hit. It wasn't instantaneous like in the movies, where men are shot and fall silently, already dead before they hit the ground. Johnny fell to his knees first, a look of confusion crossing his face, as if he couldn't quite grasp what had happened. He looked down, saw blood beginning to bloom through his uniform in the abdomen, and then his eyes met the Marine's. There was so much in that look: surprise, fear, a silent question the Marine had no answer for. Johnny tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing, but instead of words, only blood bubbled between his lips. He fell sideways onto the sharp coral, and the Marine was there, holding him, screaming for a medic who was 100 meters away tending to 3 other wounded, screaming for Johnny to stay awake, to keep breathing, to stay alive. The Marine pressed his hands against the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding, but there was too much blood. Too much blood for 2 hands to hold, warm blood slipping between his fingers, no matter how hard he pressed. Johnny held the Marine's hand with surprising strength for a dying man, his fingers squeezing as if that physical connection were the only thing keeping him tethered to life. His lips moved again, and this time the Marine leaned in close, his ear almost touching Johnny's bloodied mouth. The words came in a wet, broken whisper. "Tell Dorothy!" "Tell her." But he never finished the sentence. The strength left his fingers. His eyes, which had been fixed on the Marine's face with desperate intensity, suddenly went blank, staring through the Marine to some place beyond where the living cannot follow. Johnny Kowalski of Milwaukee died there on the Peleliu reef, his hand still holding the Marine's, his final message to his wife, lost forever in the dusty island air. And something fundamental in the Marine died with him in that moment. Not his body, not his ability to fight, but something deeper, perhaps his belief that there was justice in the universe. Perhaps his faith that good people deserved happy endings. There was a pact between Marines that never needed to be spoken aloud because it was understood on a level more fundamental than words. No one gets left behind. It didn't matter the fire raging around you. It didn't matter that going to get a fallen man almost certainly meant dying trying. It didn't matter that the brutal mathematics of war dictated that it was wiser to leave 1 man to save 10. The pact was absolute, unbreakable, sacred in a way that even chaplains couldn't fully articulate. You don't abandon your brother, ever, because if you do, if you turn your back on a man who trusted you to bring him back, you may survive physically, but you will die inside. You will become something less than human. Something that can't look itself in the mirror. Something that spends the rest of its life wondering if it could have made a difference. The Marines saw this pact fulfilled every day on Peleliu, saw men making choices that defied all logic of self-preservation because there was something more important than survival. There was the responsibility of deserving survival. A corporal he barely knew ran through crossfire to pull a wounded soldier back to cover. He managed to drag the man 5 meters before taking a bullet in the leg. He fell, limped to his feet, and kept dragging. He took another bullet, this time in the shoulder. He kept going. He managed to bring the wounded man back to friendly lines before collapsing from blood loss. Both survived. A sergeant carried an unconscious Marine on his back for over 1 kilometer through coral that cut his feet to the bone with every step. When he finally reached the medical station, his feet were strips of bloody flesh, barely recognizable as human feet. He didn't care. The man he carried lived to see his children grow up. The Marine witnessed these acts not occasionally, but constantly, repeatedly, as if each man were trying to prove something to himself, to his comrades, perhaps to God, if he still believed in a God who allowed places like Peleliu to exist. Amid the overwhelming horror, there were stolen moments of humanity that shone with a purity the Marine had never experienced before and would never experience again. Small moments, insignificant to any outside observer, but which meant everything to men living second to second with no guarantee they would see the next minute. The Marine had half a canteen of water remaining, half of a day's already insufficient ration, when he encountered another Marine he didn't know, dehydrated to the point of convulsions. His lips cracked and bleeding, his eyes rolled back to the whites. Without thinking, without hesitation, without accounting for his own needs, the Marine tipped the canteen into the stranger's mouth. The man drank, choked, drank more. When he regained consciousness enough to realize what had happened, tears began streaming down his grime-covered face. They weren't tears for the water, even though the water had literally saved her life. They were tears for the gesture, for the fact that in a place where every instinct screamed at you to protect yourself first, someone had chosen to see you as more important than their own survival. At night, When the gunfire dwindled to occasional sniper fire, and everyone was too tired to move much, the Marines huddled in small groups and told stories of home. Simple stories about simple lives that seemed to belong to another universe entirely. An 18-year-old boy from North Carolina spoke of his father's tobacco farm with a love so deep in his voice, you could feel the red earth beneath your feet, smell the leaves curing in the barns. He would take over the farm, he said. Plant not just tobacco, but corn as well. Diversify as his father should have done years ago. Marry his high school sweetheart, Sarah, who waited faithfully for him, writing letters every week. Have children who would grow up knowing the value of honest work. His voice grew soft and distant when he spoke of these things, as if he were praying rather than conversing. The Marine found himself memorizing every detail of the story, committing it to memory as if it were important to preserve these dreams, even if the dreamer could not. 3 days later, the North Carolina boy took a mortar shrapnel to the throat. He died in less than a minute, drowning in his own blood, unable to make a sound beyond a horrible gurgling. The Marine never learned his full last name, but he still remembered his girlfriend's name, Sarah, and wondered if she had waited and how long she had waited before accepting that he would never return. The weight of leadership on Peleliu fell on impossibly young shoulders because veteran officers died so quickly that sergeants in their early 20s found themselves commanding entire platoons, making decisions that determined life and death for dozens of men. The Marines' platoon sergeant was 23. 23. He should have been finishing college, worried about exams and girls and what career to choose. Instead, he was on Peleliu, commanding 40 Marines, pointing to coral outcrops and saying things like, "You three, take that position," knowing full well he was potentially signing death warrants, that some of the men he'd ordered forward wouldn't come back. The 3 Marines he'd assigned didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't point out the obvious suicidal danger. They just nodded, checked their weapons and went. Because that's what you did. Because someone had to go, and if it wasn't you, it would be another friend, another brother. 2 of the 3 came back. The 3rd took a grenade and simply ceased to exist, transformed from person to red mist in a split second. The 23-year-old sergeant vomited afterward, alone behind a coral outcrop where no one could see him, his entire body shaking with silent sobs. But the next morning he had to do it again and again, day after day, until the choice was no longer a choice, but merely mechanical, until he could send men to die with a straight face, because feeling too much would kill him too. The Marine tried to write a letter several times during the brief lulls in combat. He would pull out crumpled paper and a barely working pen, start with "Dear Mum," and then stop, the pen hovering over the paper, unable to find the next words. How do you describe this to someone who will never understand? How do you say, "I'm fine," when you clearly aren't? He would try again, starting differently. "If you're reading this..." But that didn't work either, because how do you write a goodbye? How do you summarize a life in a few sentences? How do you say goodbye to your mother? He would tear up the paper, try again. And again. The letter never came out right, because there were no right words for what Peleliu had become. He kept it in his pocket anyway, next to the optimistic letter he'd written on the ship before landing, the one about 4 easy days and being back soon. 2 letters written by the same man that barely seemed to come from the same person. He picked them up sometimes, read the naive words of the first letter, and barely remembered the young man who had written them. That young man was dead, dead as surely as Johnny, dead as completely as the boy from the tobacco farm. One night, the Marine looked at his hands in the dim light of a controlled fire the Marines had risked lighting to heat rations. His hands were unrecognizable, covered in dried blood that had mixed with coral dust to form a reddish-brown crust. New scars crisscrossed older ones. Coral was literally embedded beneath his broken fingernails, fragments of volcanic rock that had lodged in the flesh and remained there. He tried to remember what those hands used to look like, clean, smooth, the hands of a farm boy who helped his father but wasn't yet hardened by adulthood. He couldn't. He simply couldn't form the mental image. He tried to remember who he was before Peleliu, the boy who loved baseball, who had a crush on the girl from church but was too shy to talk to her, who thought war would be an adventure. This boy was a stranger now, someone the Marine vaguely knew had existed but could no longer access. Something new had been born in his place, something harder, darker, something that did what needed to be done without hesitation or remorse, because hesitation killed and remorse was a luxury you couldn't afford. He didn't know if this transformation was good or bad. He had no energy for moral judgments about what he had become. He only knew it was necessary. To survive Peleliu, you had to become something capable of surviving Peleliu, and that meant killing parts of yourself that would never grow back. If the beach had been hell and the caves purgatory, then the mountainous heights of Peleliu were something beyond theology's vocabulary. Bloody Nose Ridge, the Five Sisters, the Pocket. These names meant absolutely nothing to the Marines before they arrived on Peleliu. They were merely markings on military maps, abstract coordinates in briefings. But after weeks of bleeding for every foot of coral, these names became legends whispered with a mixture of dread and sickening reverence. Each rise was a natural fortress that seemed designed by some malevolent god specifically to maximize American death. Coral walls that rose at impossible angles, narrow canyons that funneled the Marines into kill zones where Japanese machine guns could effortlessly mow down entire ranks. Artillery positions hidden in caves that could bombard any approach without ever being seen. And over all this, the relentless heat and eternal thirst that turned each assault into a race against one's own disintegrating body. Bloody Nose Ridge was named not for any single incident of heroism or tragedy, but simply because the blood never stopped flowing there. It was perhaps 100 meters high, but it could have been Mount Everest for the difficulty of conquering it. The slopes were too steep for a coordinated approach. 45 degrees in some places, 50 in others, essentially vertical climbs on coral that cut like glass at every point of contact. There was nothing to hold on to except more sharp coral. Every grip ripped open the palms. Every step up slipped half a step down as the fragmented coral gave way under the weight of their boots. And as the Marines climbed, slow, exposed, defenseless, the Japanese, entrenched at the top, rained death down upon them with a mechanical efficiency that seemed almost casual. Machine guns swept the slopes in calculated patterns. Mortars fell with practiced precision. Artillery turned entire sections of the mountain into eruptions of fragments and smoke. Grenades rolled downhill, small spheres of death that exploded among the huddled Marines. The Marine watched a man in front of him take a bullet in the head as he climbed. There was no drama, no heroic scream, no cinematic moment. The man's head simply split into a red mist, and his body began to roll downhill, gaining speed, colliding with other Marines trying to move away, leaving a wet, dark trail in the white coral. The body rolled past the Marine so close that he could see the face, or what was left of it, and vaguely recognized it as someone he had shared cigarettes with a few days ago. He kept climbing because to stop was to die, because to give up was to die, because the only direction that offered even the illusion of progress was up. His lungs burned. His hands bled so profusely that the coral was slippery under his palms. Every muscle screamed to stop, to rest, to simply give up. But he kept climbing because that's what you did. You climbed until you died, or until you reached the top. And then, if you were lucky or cursed enough to reach the top, you killed everyone you encountered and hoped it had counted for something. The numbers were obscene, in a way that made it difficult to process as reality rather than abstract statistics. Some platoons lost 50% of their men in a single day of assaulting the heights. Half, 40 men, became 20 before the sun set. 20 men who had to hold the same amount of ground, accomplish the same missions, fight with the same intensity despite being reduced by half. Officers lasted days if they were extraordinarily lucky, hours if they were ordinary. Lieutenants fresh from the relief boats were killed before they learned the names of their own men. A lieutenant took command of the Marine platoon at 9 in the morning and was dead by 11:15. taken by a sniper before he could even complete his first orders. Entire companies were decimated. 300 men reduced to 50, 60 if they were lucky. And those 50 still had to fight, still had to attack, still had to climb those damned heights as if they were a full force. The Marine looked around at the remains of his original platoon and did the math he didn't want to do. 40 had landed on the beach that first terrible day that felt like years instead of weeks ago. 12 were still alive. 12, and they weren't even halfway across the island yet. The ridges stretched ahead like serrated teeth in a giant jaw, each promising more death, more mutilation, more names added to the growing list of men the Marine tried to remember, but who were beginning to merge into an indistinct mass of dead faces. There was something mathematically impossible about continuing. If you lost 70% of your men and still had half the island to go, the math said no one would survive. And yet you continued because no one had given you permission to stop, because giving up wasn't an option, because you stupidly trusted that somehow you would be one of the lucky ones who beat the odds. There was a moment no one witnessed except those directly involved, a moment that appeared in no official report or medal citation. A Marine, not the Marine in this story, but another, equally anonymous, equally forgotten by history, lay wounded and lying on exposed ground between the lines. Crossfire tore through the air above him. Bullets ricocheted off the coral, creating small explosions of sharp fragments. The man screamed for help, but his cry was weak, already drained from blood loss. Everyone in the Marines unit could hear him. Everyone knew exactly where he was. And everyone knew that going to get him was complete and obvious suicide. You would have to run across 30 meters of open ground under fire from at least 2 machine gun positions, and probably mortars as well. The chances of reaching him were minuscule. The chances of bringing him back were essentially zero. The Marine made no conscious decision. There was no moment of heroic deliberation where he weighed his life against the life of the wounded man. He simply got up and ran. His body moved before his mind could protest, some instinct deeper than self-preservation taking over. He ran in a crouch, zigzagging, every muscle tense, waiting for the impact of the bullet that would bring him down. Bullets slammed into the coral around him. He could hear the impacts, see small geysers of fragments exploding. One passed so close to his head that he felt the air pressure, the impossible heat of friction. His brain clinically registered that he should be dead, that by all laws of probability, one of those bullets should have found flesh. But somehow he kept running and somehow reached the wounded man. Grabbing the wounded man and starting to drag him back was when the situation went from probable suicide to guaranteed suicide. Now he was moving slower, overwhelmed, an even better target. The wounded man screamed as he was pulled over the jagged coral, the pain of the movement adding to his original injuries. The Marine had no time for kindness. He dragged, pulled, half-carried the man across those endless 30 meters as the world exploded around them. A bullet hit the pack on his back with enough force to make him stumble. He regained his balance and kept going. Another bullet passed between his legs, literally between his legs, missing his groin by inches. He kept dragging. Finally, impossibly and miraculously, they reached cover. The Marines pulled the wounded man to safety, while the Marine who had rushed to retrieve him collapsed, shaking uncontrollably, only now realizing what he had done and how close he had come to dying. No one saw beyond the men immediately present. No officer witnessed to write a report. No photographer captured the moment. There was no medal, no silver star, no mention in general orders. Just 2 men, one who risked everything for a stranger, another who lived to eventually return home to children and grandchildren who would never know how close he had come to never existing. And for the Marine who made the rescue, that was enough. Or it had to be enough, because there was nothing else. There was no recognition, no proper gratitude for the act, only the private knowledge that when it counted, when it truly mattered, he hadn't failed his brother. On Peleliu, where everything was taken from you, where each day stole another piece of your humanity. Small victories like this were all that kept you human. But not every choice had a right answer. The war on Peleliu forced Marines to make impossible choices that no human being should have to make, moral dilemmas that had no good or satisfactory solution. Leave a gravely wounded friend to save 5 men who could still walk and fight. Brutal mathematics dictated that you leave one to save 5. But brutal mathematics never looked into the eyes of a dying man, never heard him beg not to be left alone. Shoot a Japanese soldier who was clearly dying, no longer posed a threat, was literally begging for water in a broken mix of Japanese and English. Pity dictated that you give him water or at least a quick death. But Peleliu had taught that pity killed, that the dying soldier could be faking, could have a hidden grenade, could be waiting precisely for your compassion to kill you. Was obeying an order you knew with absolute certainty suicide? Refusal meant possible court-martial, certain disgrace. Obeying meant almost certainly dying without purpose. The Marine made these choices. They all did. And they all lived with them as best they could, which usually meant not thinking too much about them, not examining the moral implications too closely, just moving forward because stopping to truly process what you had become was a path to madness. He left men behind when carrying them all would have meant no one would survive. He shot enemies who may or may not have been real threats. He followed orders that seemed insane, and each choice took away another piece of the person he had been, added another weight to the burden of guilt and trauma he would carry for the rest of his life. There were no right answers on Peleliu. There was only survive or not survive, and sometimes surviving meant doing things that would make you question whether survival was worth the price. There was a truth about courage that no one in the United States really talked about because it didn't fit the heroic narrative they wanted to believe about their soldiers. The truth was that sometimes, often in fact, courage had nothing to do with charging boldly under fire. It wasn't about dramatic headline-grabbing acts of heroism. Sometimes courage was simply the choice not to desert, not to eat a bullet, not to simply sit back and give up and let the war take him. The Marine didn't feel brave, not even a little. He felt terrified every minute of every day. He felt exhausted to the bone, so tired that he sometimes fantasized about taking a non-fatal wound just so he could be evacuated and sleep. He felt broken in ways he instinctively knew would never fully heal. But every morning he woke, when he could sleep, and grabbed his gun and did what needed to be done. Not because he was brave, because the alternative was to give up. And giving up would mean betraying all the men around him who were also terrified, also exhausted, also broken, but who kept going anyway. So maybe that was courage. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of enough purpose to keep going despite the fear. Not strength, but the refusal to crumble. Not heroism, but simply the stubborn stubbornness of not giving up when giving up would be easier. Every Marine on Peleliu who woke up another day and chose to keep fighting rather than break completely, each demonstrated a kind of courage that would never be fully recognized or understood. The courage to simply persist when every fiber of your being screamed to stop. The courage to endure the unbearable not for glory, but because the men beside you were enduring it too, and you couldn't be the one to let them down. That was the real courage of Peleliu. Not the isolated acts of extraordinary heroism, though those certainly existed, but the collective, daily choice of thousands of Marines not to completely break down, despite having every reason in the world to do so. November 27th, 1944, 73 days after that initial landing that had been promised as a 4-day operation. A senior officer too clean, his uniform too starched, someone who clearly hadn't spent the last 2.5 months bleeding on coral, stood on a pile of rubble and formally declared Peleliu conquered. His voice sounded strangely loud in the relative silence. The gunfire had dwindled to occasional sniper fire, instead of the constant roar that had been the soundtrack of existence for endless weeks. Conquered. The word hung in the hot air like something obscene. Like a bad joke no one found funny. There was no victory parade. There was no celebration. There was no flag being raised high above while a band played and men wept with patriotic joy. There were only Marines sitting or lying wherever they had stood, covered in layers of dirt and blood and powdered coral that made them look like ghosts, more dead than alive. The Marine felt nothing when he heard the declaration. Not relief, not joy, not satisfaction at a job well done, only a deep, frightening emptiness, as if the battle's end had removed the only purpose that kept him going, and he was now adrift without direction. Some men around him were crying, but they weren't tears of happiness. They were tears of exhaustion, so complete that the body simply couldn't contain the emotion anymore. They were tears of relief, not because they had won, but because finally, they were allowed to stop. Others simply sat staring into space, their eyes glazed and empty, seeing things no one else could see, trapped in memories of moments that would never free them. The victory didn't feel like what any of them had imagined victory would feel like. It felt like survival by a margin so thin it barely counted. It felt like being alive by accident rather than merit. As the official numbers began to circulate, and they circulated slowly, reluctantly, as if the officers were embarrassed to admit them aloud, the true magnitude of what had happened on Peleliu began to become impossible to ignore. 1,794 Marines dead, not wounded, not missing, but dead. Bodies that had to be collected from the coral, identified when possible, sent home in sealed caskets to families who would never see what was left of their sons, husbands, brothers. 8,010 wounded. Men missing limbs, men burned beyond recognition, men with wounds that would cripple them for the rest of their lives. And these were just the physical injuries that could be counted and catalogued. No one was counting the invisible wounds, the psychological traumas that would turn seemingly whole men into empty shells, the nightmares that would begin within weeks and continue for decades. Nearly 10,000 American casualties. For an island measuring 6 square miles, an island so small you could walk from one end to the other in a few hours if no one was trying to kill you. An insignificant speck of coral and volcanic rock lost in the vast Pacific, a place 99% of Americans back home couldn't locate on a map if their lives depended on it. And slowly, in whispered conversations between officers who thought no one was listening, between war correspondents trying to make sense of what they had witnessed, the truth began to emerge like a festering wound. Peleliu wasn't needed for the Philippine campaign. American forces could have simply bypassed the island, let the Japanese garrison languish without supplies or reinforcements, neutralize the threat without losing a single Marine. The battle had been a strategic error, a flawed calculation by some distant general, who would never have to look widows and mothers in the eye and explain why their loved ones had died conquering territory that didn't need conquering. 10,000 men paid the price for that mistake. 10,000 lives permanently altered, ended or destroyed or transformed into something unrecognizable by a decision that was wrong from the start. And finding that out changed nothing. It didn't bring Johnny back from Milwaukee. It didn't restore the legs or arms or faces of the maimed. It didn't erase the memories of the tunnels and the choir and the screams. History might eventually judge Peleliu as unnecessary. Commanders might admit their mistake with silent shame. But for the men who fought there, for the families who lost there, history's judgment was empty consolation. The pain was real. The loss was real. And no retrospective admission of strategic error could change that. The Marine returned home. Physically, eventually, after processing and paperwork and the slow machinery of military demobilization, he boarded a ship and crossed the Pacific back to California, then traveled cross-country back home. His body was relatively intact. A few scars, some hearing loss from the constant bombardment, lungs that would never fully function again after inhaling so much smoke and coral dust. But intact enough that he seemed normal to casual observers, so that his family could hug him and say, "Thank God you came back in one piece," without realizing the cruel irony of the statement. Because he wasn't whole, not even close. Peleliu had come with him, had nestled in his mind like a parasite, had become a permanent part of who he was now. He lay in bed at home, on clean sheets that smelled of soap and sun, in a quiet room where the only sound was the distant ticking of a clock. And he could still feel the coral cutting into his back. He sat at the dinner table with his family, eating real food on real plates, listening to chatter about local events and neighborhood gossip, and he could still hear the screams of dying men. Johnny's screams for Dorothy, the warning shouts before the grenades exploded. His mother spoke to him, and he had to ask her to repeat them because he was half deaf now, but also because half his mind was always elsewhere. Always returning to that damned island where part of him would remain forever trapped. He was home, he was safe, but he never felt safe. Every loud noise made him jump. Crowds made him nervous in ways he couldn't explain. He began to avoid people, avoid social situations, avoid anything that required him to pretend to be the person he used to be. His mother noticed, of course. Mothers always do. She watched him with worried eyes. This son, who had returned from war, changed in ways she couldn't fully identify, but that frightened her. One day, she said softly, trying to reach him across the distance that had grown between them, "You're different. You're not the same boy who left." And he forced a smile, that lying smile he'd perfected to reassure people who couldn't understand. "I'm fine, Mom," he said. "I just need time to readjust." But he wasn't fine, and time wasn't helping. And with each passing day, he felt further away from the life everyone around him expected him to resume. More trapped in memories of a place where he shouldn't have survived, but somehow had. Every night the nightmares. Without exception, without relief, relentless as Peleliu itself had been. He was back in the caves, the darkness pressing in on all sides, the air too thick to breathe, the sound of footsteps approaching but you couldn't see from where. He was climbing Bloody Nose Ridge again, his hands slipping on the bloody coral, men falling around him in horrific slow motion. He held Johnny as he died, watching the light fade from his eyes, hearing those last unspoken words to Dorothy. Johnny died again, and again, and again. Every night. The boy from the tobacco farm died. The 23-year-old sergeant died. All the faces he tried to remember but had begun to fade died over and over in his sleep. And he woke sometimes screaming, other times just sweating, shaking, taking minutes to convince himself he was home, that he was safe, that Peleliu was over. His wife, he had married after returning, desperately trying to build a normal life, would wake with him, hold his hand, whisper that everything was okay. "You're home," she'd say. "It was just a nightmare. You're safe now." And he cherished the comfort, even though he knew she was wrong. It hadn't been just a nightmare. It had been memory, accurate in every horrific detail. And he wasn't safe because part of him had never left Peleliu, never returned home, was trapped forever on that island, climbing endless heights under endless fire. He smelled things no one else could smell. Burning flesh, fresh blood mixed with coral dust, gunpowder and sweat and death. The smells would hit him at random moments, at the grocery store, at work, driving through town, and for a second he was back there, completely back, not remembering but reliving. Eventually, inevitably, someone would ask. Usually it was someone well-meaning, someone who didn't understand that some questions don't have satisfying answers. Was it worth it? They'd ask. The war, I mean. Peleliu, was it worth it? And the Marine never knew what to say. How do you answer that? Was it worth watching your friends die in your arms? No, obviously not. Was it worth the trauma that woke you screaming every night 20 years later? No. Was it worth fighting and bleeding and nearly dying for an island that commanders later admitted wasn't necessary? How could it be worth it? But then he thought about standing by his brothers, about never leaving a man behind, about keeping the pact that kept them human amidst inhumanity. Was it worth it? Maybe. He thought about doing his duty when it would have been easier to give up, about choosing to keep going when every instinct screamed to stop. Was it worth proving to himself that he could? Maybe he thought about returning home when so many didn't, about having the chance to build a life when Johnny and the farm boy and thousands of others never would. Was it worth being alive? Yes, but also no, because the person who came back wasn't the person who left. And sometimes he wondered if survival counted as victory when you had to sacrifice so much of yourself to achieve it. So was it worth it? He didn't know. He honestly didn't know. And no one who hadn't been there could understand why the question was impossible to answer. Why reducing Peleliu to a simple calculation of value versus cost was an insult to the complexity of what had been endured there. The Marine returned from Peleliu. That's what the official records say. His name is there on the demobilization documents, on the paperwork that released him from active duty, on the veterans' records confirming his return to civilian life. He crossed the Pacific, landed on American soil, traveled back to his hometown, where people who had known him since childhood greeted him with hugs and tears of relief. His body returned. That's undeniable. He walked the same streets he had walked before the war, slept in the same house, saw the same familiar faces. But anyone who truly knew him, anyone who looked beyond the surface, could see that something fundamental had been left behind on that island of bloodied coral. His eyes were different now, older, more distant, haunted by visions no one around him could see. He smiled when appropriate, laughed when expected, participated in the routines of normal life. But it was performance, trained muscle responding to social stimuli, not the genuine expression of a man who had truly returned home. Inside, where no one could see, he was still in the caves. He still climbed those impossible coral cliffs that he cut through and never finished. He still held Johnny's hand as the life drained from his friend's eyes. He still heard the nighttime screams of Japanese soldiers calling out in perfect English. Still felt the 115-degree heat cooking his brain, still tasted the mixture of blood and coral dust that had become the permanent flavor of Peleliu. His mind, that essential part of him that processed the world and found meaning in existence, never truly left the island. It remained trapped there, reliving the same 73 endless days in an infinite loop, unable to move forward, unable to heal, unable to forget even for a moment. He existed simultaneously in two places, physically on the peaceful streets of America, mentally in the death zones of Peleliu. And this division, this being in two places at once, made him complete in nowhere. If there is a lesson that emerges from the bloody ruins of Peleliu, it is not about military strategy or combat tactics or the technicalities of amphibious warfare. These things can be taught in military academies, studied by historians, debated by experts. The true lesson of Peleliu is about something more fundamental, more human, more important than any tactical consideration. It is about what human beings are capable of enduring when endurance seems impossible. It's about how much punishment the body and mind can absorb before breaking, and about the miraculous and terrifying fact that the breaking point is far, far beyond what anyone untested could imagine. The Marines on Peleliu were pushed beyond all reasonable limits of human endurance. They were deprived of water in murderous heat. They were forced to fight in terrain that seemed designed to cause maximum suffering. They were bombarded with trauma after trauma, with no time to process or recover. And they kept going. They kept going not because they were superhuman, but because they discovered reserves of resilience they didn't know they possessed. Because they refused to completely crumble, even when they had every justification to do so. What we learned from Peleliu, what every person who studies that horrific battle should understand, is that courage is not what we think it is. It's not the absence of fear or the possession of some innate heroic quality that ordinary people don't possess. Courage isn't being unafraid. Every man on Peleliu was afraid. Every damn day, every damn minute. Afraid of the next bullet, the next grenade, the next mortar attack. Afraid of being burned alive in the tunnels. Afraid of dying of thirst under the merciless sun. Afraid that today would be the day their luck finally ran out. The fear was constant, oppressive, debilitating. But courage is what you do despite the fear. It's being afraid and going anyway. It's being broken into 1,000 pieces and still rising for another day. It's wanting to give up with every fiber of your being, but choosing to keep going, because the men beside you are keeping going, and you can't be the one to let them down. Courage is simply persisting when persistence seems impossible. And every Marine who set foot on Peleliu, every Marine who survived the 73 days, and every Marine who died trying, demonstrated this kind of courage in a way that should humble anyone who thinks they know what it means to be brave. There is a bond between the men who fought together on Peleliu that transcends any normal relationship people experience in peacetime. It is a bond forged not in shared happy moments or mutual interests, but in shared trauma, in suffering endured side by side, in impossible choices made together. The men who survived Peleliu carried this bond for the rest of their lives. They didn't need to talk about it. In fact, most rarely spoke about the island even among themselves, because some things are too heavy for words. But there was an instant recognition when two Peleliu veterans met. A look, a nod, and they knew. You were there. I was there. And this shared experience, this knowledge that the other person truly understood what no one else could, created a connection that death could not sever. The dead lived on in the survivors in tangible, real ways, not as vague memories that faded with time, but as permanent presences. The Marine carried Johnny with him every day for the rest of his life. He carried the boy from the tobacco farm and his dreams of planting corn. He carried the 23-year-old sergeant who had to send men to die. He carried all the faces, all the names he could remember, and the ones he had forgotten, but still felt the loss of. They lived through him, because he survived when they didn't, and there was a responsibility in that he could never ignore. As long as he lived, they wouldn't be completely dead. Their stories would live on in his memory. Their sacrifices would be remembered, even if the world forgot them. This was the survivor's burden, but it was also his purpose. He had to live not only for himself, but for all those who didn't get the chance. Stephen Ambrose dedicated his life to studying ordinary men in war, and he understood something profound about the line between heroism and survival that most people never grasp. He wrote, "In war, the line between heroism and survival is so thin that no one who wasn't there can ever truly understand." This statement perfectly captures the essence of Peleliu. The acts that seemed heroic from the outside, the Marine running under fire to rescue a wounded man, the sergeant holding his ground against impossible odds, the men climbing heights where half of them would die. These acts didn't seem heroic to the people performing them. They felt like doing what had to be done to survive. They felt like having no choice. They felt like keeping the pact with your brothers, because betraying that pact would be worse than dying. The line between heroism and survival on Peleliu was so thin it was invisible. And anyone who tries to judge from the outside, who tries to categorize acts as heroic or simply necessary, fundamentally misunderstands the reality of what those men faced. For the Marine who survived Peleliu, and for all the others who somehow lived through that hell, there is something that needs to be said, something they may never have heard clearly enough. You didn't fight for a coral island that turned out not to be necessary. You didn't fight for strategic objectives that generals decided and then reconsidered. You didn't fight for glory or recognition or your name in the newspapers. You fought for the life of the man beside you. When Johnny fell, you kept fighting for his memory, to ensure his death meant something, even if the larger battle meant nothing. You fought because giving up would have betrayed all the other men who were also terrified and broken, but who chose to carry on. This is the whole truth of Peleliu, the only truth that truly matters when you strip away all strategy and politics and historical context. Men fought for other men. Brothers fought for brothers. And in this brotherhood forged in horror, there was something purer and truer than any national cause or military objective could be. When you think of heroes, and we should all think of heroes, especially in an age that sometimes seems to have forgotten what real heroism requires, Don't just think of those who won battles or received medals or whose names are on monuments. Think of those who chose to stay when everything, absolutely everything, told them to run. Think of those who continued when it would have been infinitely easier, more rational, more justifiable to give up. Think of those who paid prices that should never be asked, in sanity and innocence, in pieces of soul left behind in forgotten places, and who never asked for gratitude or recognition in return. This is the true cost of the freedom we enjoy. It's not the flags raised, or the street parades, or the political speeches about sacrifice. It's the broken men who returned home, but never really returned. It's the nights they didn't sleep for the next 50 years. It's the relationships they couldn't maintain because Peleliu had changed them in ways that made intimacy impossible. It is the invisible wounds that never healed, the memories that never faded, the abiding weight of having survived when so many did not. This is the real cost. And we owe these men more than we can repay, more than we will ever adequately acknowledge. We owe them at least to remember, at least to understand as much as possible from the outside what was asked of them, at least to honor not only the victory, but the terrible price paid for it. The 1,794 Marines who died on Peleliu, and the thousands more who returned home carrying Peleliu within them forever, they are the true monument. They are the true history. And as long as we remember them, as long as we tell their stories with the honesty and reverence they deserve, they will not be completely lost.